Welcome to today's webinar, Dr. Marzano's Formative Assessment and Standards-Based Grading. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jed Vanderzanden, and I'm Solution Tree's Regional Representative for the Great Lakes States. If you're not familiar with the region, it includes Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. Solution Tree has a team of regional representatives located across the country. Our role is to support and help with planning assistance to schools and districts to help them take advantage of all that Solution Tree and Marzano Research Labs has to offer. I'm in Chicago this week, so please pardon the backdrop of the hotel kitchenette. And I hope you'll enjoy today's session. It's always a pleasure to offer you the best access to Bob via video webinar. Before we begin, there are a few tips. Use your chat dialog box for technical questions about sound or video, and send those to the username Marzano Research. Also, you'll be placed on mute during the webinar. Type any content-related questions in the chat box, and Dr. Marzano will answer these at the end of the presentation. We'll reserve some time at the end for your questions to be answered. Also, webinar recording and handouts will be available on the website within 5 days at www.marzano.research.com, and you can see the rest. We'll send you an email, so you don't need to write that down, within the next 5 days. All right, well, our speaker today is Dr. Robert J. Marzano. Dr. Marzano is the co-founder and CEO of Marzano Research Laboratory in Englewood, Colorado. He's a leading research leader. He's a speaker, trainer, and author of more than 30 books and 150 articles on topics such as instruction, assessment, writing and implementing standards, effective leadership, and intervention. His books include Designing and Teaching Learning Goals and Objectives, District Leadership That Works, Formative Assessment and Standards-Based Grading, On Excellence in Teaching, and The Art and Science of Teaching. His practical translations of the most current research and theory into classroom strategies are internationally known and widely practiced by both teachers and administrators. I'd also like to briefly talk about Marzano Research Laboratory. MRL is a joint venture between Solution Tree and Dr. Marzano. In service to educators, the company synthesizes Dr. Marzano's research, world-renowned for its breadth and depth, into accessible components teachers and principals can use for concrete gains in student learning. Continuous action research ensures MRL strategies are always at the forefront of best practice. MRL consistently analyzes that work in schools and classrooms and always presents research that reflects the current knowledge base of best practice for enhancing student achievement. All right, Bob, take it away.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate that. And just to give a little more background, well, hello, I'm glad you joined us. My name is Bob Marzano. I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado, actually a suburb of Denver called Englewood, Colorado. And we'll be about an hour today. And as Jed said, if you type in your questions, I'll try to get to them at the end of my little presentation here. Started Marzano Research Lab a few years ago, depending on how you might count, 2 or 3 years ago, and with the specific purpose of being able to provide K-12 educators, that's administrators and teachers, with practical strategies that's based on the best available research possible. As Jed mentioned in the previous slide there, we actually do continue to do action research. If you go onto our website, marzanoresearch.com, you can actually see a database of over 500 experimental control studies we've done in the last 5 years with teachers across the country. And you're invited to participate in that. And there are directions about how you might join us in research. And if individual teachers, we do that free. So we always try to keep up to date, not only with other people's research, but we then try to use that in the schools and districts that we work with. As you can see, we have a specific mission, and that's to provide the best research and most useful actions to educators, translating high-quality educational research into practical tools. And in time, we'd like to be the place that teachers go for the latest information and data, synthesizing the clear, concise resources that facilitate action. In other words, translating the things you can do right away. So today's topic is formative assessment and standards-based grading. It's part of a series that we have on classroom strategies. And each of the series is similar in format. First chapter we talk about the research, but after that it's all practical applications with actually exercises teachers can do or educators can do to see if they understand the concepts. If you're interested in this topic, it's that little green book there, Formative Assessment and Standards-Based Grading. As you all know, that's a topic that has been around for quite a long time, formative assessment. Just some things we know about it now. Well, first of all, people agree in general as to what formative assessment is intended to do, but as to the specifics, there is some disagreement as to what is formative assessment and what isn't. I'm going to give you a very specific cut, that's our cut, on what formative assessment is, which is, you know, in large part very similar to what other people talk about, but we have some very unique aspects of ours too. And again, if you're interested in how we do it, you might take a look at that book. Well, people do agree in general that it's a process. It's not a specific test. So technically, the same assessment could be used for both summative purposes and formative purposes. Well, that's not a recommended practice. When you design assessment, you should have a purpose in mind. But it isn't a test. Matter of fact, a specific test. Matter of fact, we tend to shy away from the use of the term formative assessment. And I'll show you in a second the term we prefer. First of all, some useful distinctions we found in working with schools and districts across the country. Now, by the way, everything I'm saying is being used. This is not just science fiction or hope for the future. You know, everything I'm talking about is being used in one way, shape, or form by individual teachers, by schools, and by districts across the country. One useful distinction for us is that between forms of assessment and uses of assessment. So I'll go into those each in a little bit of detail, not much though. And remember, Jed said we'll send you these slides if you're interested. So forms of assessment versus use of assessment. Let me do forms of assessment. There are at least three general forms of assessment. And again, these have been around for a long time. One is obtrusive, the other is unobtrusive, and the other is student-generated. And I think we tend to only focus on one type or one form. Actually, I think we tend to obsess on it, and that's the obtrusive form of assessment. It might be a funny term, but if you just think about it, it makes sense. An obtrusive assessment is one where instruction stops and assessment occurs. And that's your typical test, if you will. So we stop instruction and take the assessment. And that's going to be there for a long time. We will always be using obtrusive assessments. Another type of assessment is the unobtrusive assessment. Now, if you look at the adjective, you can kind of figure out what we're getting at here. And again, this term has been around for a long time there. I remember reading a book in the early 70s about unobtrusive measurements, they call it. And unobtrusive assessment is one in which the student, first of all, instruction does not stop. And actually, technically, in an unobtrusive assessment, the student might not even know he or she is being assessed. And they might say, well, how can that happen? Well, it's not easy in math, science, language, arts, and social studies, but if you think of the subject areas that are more skill or process-based, specifically physical skills and physical processes, it's used all the time. For example, if you're an art teacher and you've taught a certain brush stroke, if you will, and are walking around the class and happen to see that a couple of students are using that brush stroke just perfectly, exactly the way that was taught, well, that's an assessment. If we could just capture the data, that's the hard part. How do we capture that information? If you're a physical education teacher and you've taught you know, how to do, how to kick a soccer ball, and you go out into the playground and you see a couple of students kicking the soccer ball using just, perfect form. That's an assessment. We just don't know how to capture the data yet. However, in our particular approach to formative assessment, we say that can be easily captured. And then one that's not, actually doesn't have as long a history in terms of forms of assessment, and that's student-generated assessment. And for me, this is the real breakthrough. Whenever you get students to start taking some partial responsibility for assessments, in other words, they start to say to the teacher, hey, I'm ready now to demonstrate that I'm at this level. We call that student-generated assessment. So forms of assessment, three types: obtrusive, which we use a lot, I think too much; unobtrusive, okay, and then student-generated. Now, so let me go to the next distinction, and that is uses of assessments. There are at least three uses of assessments. Now, by the way, I've got a bit of a cough, so I'm going to be sipping on water here. I apologize. three uses of assessment. One is for formative scores, so we're trying to avoid the use of formative assessments to avoid confusion. So we call them formative scores. Another is summative scores, and then another, or the third, is instructional feedback. So assessment can be used in three ways: formative scores, summative scores, and instructional feedback. Let me just go into these a little more in depth. Formative scores, well, you can read it. They can be derived from any one of those three types of assessments: obtrusive, unobtrusive, and student-generated. Now, to make them formative scores, they have to be, first of all, the assessment has to be actually scored and recorded in some fashion. And for us, they can, and in fact, should be used to track student progress over time. So it's best to show this in a graph here. Let's say there's a particular instructional objective or learning goal, depending on the nomenclature you're using, what you want to call it, and it's for understanding and using decimals. Now, it would be more descriptive than that, but this is the shorthand version for a form. In other words, you would give students a little more detail in terms of the goal, but this for a form would just say understand and use decimals. And there are assessments over time. The first column represents October 5th and October 12th and October 20th, and you get the idea. Now remember, those don't all have to be obtrusive assessments. The October 5th assessment could have been obtrusive, okay, but the October 12th could have been a student-generated. The October 20th could have been another student-generated. The November 12th could have been an observation, unobtrusive, observation or teacher-made. So you can actually generate more assessments with less testing if you expand your notion of what assessment is. So teachers look at this sometimes and say, well, I couldn't give all those tests on the same topic, and you're right, you couldn't. But the idea is not to just give tests, a form of obtrusive assessments all the time. Use various ways of getting assessment data about student, including the unobtrusive and the student-generated, and all of a sudden you can collect more data. Actually, you can test less but assess more in a system like this. Summative scores. And so formative scores track progress over time, and critical piece there, I'm going to go back to that, is students can see where they started and see where they ended up. And that can be a very powerful instructional tool. They see where they started, see where they ended up. Has motivational implications. Has, for the student, it has implications for the teacher in terms of changing instruction based on these patterns for students. Summative scores, I'll let you read it. So again, they can come from all three types of measurements. Again, they're scored and recorded in some fashion. And they represent, a summative score represents a student's final status after some interval of time. The tracking of student progress plays a key part in assigning summative scores. So this was the same graph as we saw before, but now if you look way to the right, that last column where it says S down at the bottom, that stands for the student summative score, and you can see the little X there. In this case, the student summative score, was a 3. Now, what the teacher did to assign that summative score is look at the pattern over time. So, stated differently, the summative score is not automatically the last score, the score on the last assessment the student took. Now, for sure, the last assessment the student took is going to be heavily weighted in the teacher's mind as to what the student summative score should be, but it's not automatic. So this, if you haven't picked it up already, just let me state it directly. A system like this puts teacher judgment at the center of the assessment process. And for us, that's exactly what should be at the center of the assessment process, teacher judgment, which uses scores on assessments to come up with a determination, but it's not absolute. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but you can see right there a bit of a kind of perspective that we have that might not be taken by other assessment folks. Now, by the way, what I just showed you, remember I said in Marzano Research Lab we do action research, and really I'm using action research loosely. The research we conduct is always what they call quasi-experimental design. We don't require a random assignment of students, although it's great if people can give us that, but we do require 2 groups, and in one group teachers try a strategy and teach content. In another group, they teach the same content but don't use the strategy and over a period of time, and then we analyze the data. Over 14 experimental control studies conducted at MRL, what I just showed you translates into, has an average effect of about 32 percentile point gain in student achievement. Now that's pretty good. Now that doesn't mean that every time it's used you get that, but on the average, that's what we've found. So that practice of tracking student progress, seeing where they started, see where they ended up, using a variety of assessments, apparently is associated with a pretty decent gain in student achievement. Now, remember the three different uses of assessment. There's formative scores, summative scores, and then finally instructional feedback. And this is for sure the most commonly used, the most common use of assessments. So they can be derived from obtrusive and unobtrusives. They're not typically student-generated. They can be scored, but typically aren't. They're not recorded. But they're used to provide students and teachers with information that should change their behavior. Let me explain that. Let me try to give you an example. Let's say I was your teacher, and I came into class. I'm your science teacher, and I say, okay, kids, take out a piece of paper. Let's have a quiz. And you would go, oh, boos from the crowd. So I give the quiz, and it's a 10-item quiz. Now, if I score that, if I take it home and score it and put it in my grade book, I've got formative scores. But let's take that same quiz, and this time I don't score it at all. I just say, let's go over the answers. Now I've got instructional feedback. So it's not the assessment per se that makes it a formative score, a summative score, or instructional feedback. It's how it's used. And I could actually even score it and still use it as instruction feedback. I just don't record it. And I might say, let's score your papers. The answer to number 1 was A. Give us, check right, or give yourself a point if you got it right. So we would have a score as a student, but I wouldn't record it. Now, actually, what a lot of my contemporaries who talk about assessment mean when they say formative assessment, we call instructional feedback. Now, that doesn't mean they're wrong or we're right. I'm just trying to give you kind of a translation. I believe Susan Brookhart, great scholar on assessment, when the books I've read of hers on formative assessment, which are very fine works, by the way, what she will sometimes call formative assessment, we refer to as instructional feedback. So you just have to pick the, again, terminology that makes the most sense to you. But for us, instructional feedback has the characteristics, typically not scored, not recorded, but it's still used as information for a teacher and students. Now, one thing that is a strong theme in all of our work is that you can never rely on a single assessment to make a determination about a student. And there's a lot of reasons, and there have been for decades, for that generalization. Let me get a little technical here. This little equation you see is actually the kind of basic equation for measurement theory that we use. So it used to be called the basic equation of classical test theory, and says the score that a student receives, that's called the observed score, by the way, is made up of 2 parts, the true score plus error. So in other words, if a student receives a score of 70 on a test, let's say, that's the observed score. But that score of 70 has 2 parts. So one part is the true score. Now that's the score the student should have received on the test if it were a perfect test and the student were approaching the test with no distractions, no personal error going into it. Well, let's say the student got a score of 70, that's the observed, but actually should have got a 75. The true score was 75. How can that happen? Well, because there was an error of about 5 points working on that student's test. Well, how can that happen? Well, should have got a 75, but the student misread some items. Or it was a time test, and the student did not get to some items that he or she knew. Let me go the other way around. Student gets a score of 70, that's the observed score, but should have got a 65. How can that happen? Well, there was 5 points of error working for the student. The student guessed and got a few questions right. When the teacher was scoring the student's assessment, the teacher gave student the benefit of the doubt when, in fact, he or she did not know the content. So your observed score, according to measurement theory, you're never really sure if that's the true score. It's always our best guess. Now, this rather technical-looking slide here is actually pretty telling. Notice the left-hand column. It says REL. That stands for reliability. And these are expected scores for reliabilities of different levels. Let me take that first row, see if this makes sense to you. Suppose a teacher's test had a reliability of 0.45. Now, by the way, reliabilities range anywhere from 0 to 1.0. Standardized tests have a reliability of about 0.85 or higher. State level tests have a reliability of 0.85 or higher. Now, typically teachers tests have a reliability of around 0.45. At least that's what we found in our work with teachers. Now, that's not very high, so it means there's a lot of wobble, if you will, a lot of imprecision or a lot of error in those tests. Now, let me dramatize that. Let's look at the second column. See where it says 70? That means the student, individual student, got a score of 70 on this teacher's test where there was a reliability of 0.45. Now, knowing that and knowing this thing called the standard deviation, and actually this table is computed based on 250 studies of the 500 plus that we've done. And we found the average thing called the standard deviation to be 12 points. With that, you can compute what they call a confidence interval. An interval in which you're 95% sure that the true score falls. In this case, that interval is 52 to 88. Let me say that differently. If a teacher-made test has a reliability of 0.45 and a student gets a score of 70, then using the formulas that are out there, you can estimate that you're 95% sure the true score could be as low as 52 or as high as 88. Now, that's pretty shocking to some folks, that range. That's a wide range of possible true scores. And as you can see, as the reliability gets higher, the range gets lower. But still, let's take the reliability of a 0.75, which is probably about as high as you're going to get for a common assessment that's designed by a school or district, or a benchmark assessment that's designed by a school or district, that a student getting a score of 70, even if the reliability is 0.75, the range of scores, possible true scores for that student, go anywhere from 58 to 82. Now, that's a long way of saying, remember, you can't rely on a single assessment, and that's a theme in all of our work. A single assessment is just a piece of data among many pieces of data, or at least it should be. Now, here's the one that, again, separates our work from other folks. We believe that the 100-point scale is really not well designed for formative scores. And if you've ever heard me speak on this or any of my colleagues in Marzano Research Laboratory, you've gone through a little activity. So if you've done this, I apologize, I'll do it quickly. Here's what we usually ask people to do. We say, you know, pretend you're going to give a test tomorrow. And this test happens to have 3 sections, Section A, Section B, and Section C. And in Section A, you have 10 items that involve simple but important contents. This might be factual details, it might be some vocabulary, and these are probably going to be multiple choice type items. So you have 10 of those. They require factual but important information that was explicitly taught. Section B has 4 items, and that's asking for a little more complex content. Maybe students have to explain a generalization or exemplify a principle, but you're looking at, you know, what was exactly taught in class. And students will have to explain here. It's more like short constructed response, if you will. And then there are 2 items that ask students to go above and beyond what was taught. In other words, these items that students can't get just by recalling, you know, and understanding what was presented in class. They have to take what was presented in class, probably those generalizations and principles, and apply them to a new situation. Now, if you were a group and we were all sitting together, I'd say individually assign, here's your task, assign points to each of those 3 sections. The only qualification I'm going to give you is the points have to add up to 100 points. So how many points for Section A, how many points for Section B, how many points for Section C? Now let me show you what happens. Let me give you 3 scenarios here. Here's one scenario where a teacher gives 40 points to Section A, 40 points to Section B, and 20 points to Section C. Now, I say, okay, let's score an assessment. Let's score my assessment. Let me tell you how well I did, though. I got them all correct on Section A. So in this scheme, I would have 40 points going for me because I got, for Section A, I got all of them correct. Section B, I got 2 correct, so in this scheme, I have 20 more points going for me, total of 60, and I got none correct in Section C. So in this scheme, I get an overall score of 60. However, suppose that you had given 70 to the first section. Now, by the way, these are common patterns. We've done this with thousands of teachers over the last 5 years. Just this silly little example. Suppose that you had given 70 points to the first section. Well, now, in that scheme, the student, I got them all correct. I got 70 points going for me. You gave 20 points to the second section. I've got another 10. None for the, and 10 points for the third section. So now I've got an 80 as opposed to a 60. One more scenario. Suppose you had given 20 to the first section, Section A. Now I've got 20 out of 20. you had given 40 to the second section B, and we got another 20, and 40 to the third section. So again, if I get all correct in section A, 2 correct in section B, and none correct in section C, my score is a 40. You get the idea. Just by the different weighting of the sections, a student could get 40, 80, or 60 on the same test. And that's because the 100-point scale, when teachers design their own assessments and then weight the items, have this huge error factor built in, and that is how they weight the items. So if we're going to use formative assessment, or try to derive formative scores from a 100-point scale, we're in a bind here. Particularly, it's very hard to track progress over time. The teacher gives one assessment that had many easy items, okay, or weighted the easy items, gave them more weight. Next assessment gives weights the more difficult items, higher. The student can actually look like they've learned less because their score has gone down, when in fact they haven't learned less, their learning is going up. So what's the solution? Well, for us, the solution is a generic template to all rubrics, and then rubrics are the primary way of scoring assessments. That's a big change. There are circumstances in which a 100-point scale makes sense, but I won't go into those. Well, I'll do it briefly, and that's if a teacher only assesses the easy stuff first, and then the 100-point scale, they set a cut score and say 80 or 80% or above, you've demonstrated the content. And then a little more difficult content, 80% or above, you show me you've known that. And then even the advanced content, a student gets 80 or above, they've demonstrated they've known that. That's the situation with a 100-point scale. Works pretty well. All other situations, boy, the 100-point scale can just turn around and bite you. So we say, first of all, start with a rubric, okay, and then design your assessments for a rubric from a rubric, and use the same generic template for rubrics all the time. So here's our generic template. It's a 5-point scale, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we always say start with the 3. Okay, that's the content you want students to understand. So student responses demonstrate no major errors or omissions regarding any of the information and or processes that were explicitly taught. That's the whole idea. Now, when a school or district designs rubrics like this, based on this template, this is the way it looks. They start with a 3. This is topic for grade 8 atmospheric processes in the water cycle. Students are expected to understand how the water cycle processes impact climate changes, also the effects of temperature and pressure in different layers of Earth's atmosphere. So you don't use the generic form of the scale. You actually use that generic form to construct a scale. Now let me go to the 2. So the 3 is the student understands, all the content that was explicitly taught. 2 says the student does not understand the more complex content, the 3, but can do some of the simpler content. Does understand that and has no major errors or omissions in the simpler content. So let me show you what it looks like when a school or district does this. So this is the same scale. So for grade 8 atmospheric processes in the water cycle, same thing there. But now look at the 2. That's a little simpler. The student recognizes and recalls basic terms like climatic patterns, atmospheric layers, stratosphere, troposphere, so just vocabulary, you don't understand that. And then the student recognizes or recalls details such as precipitation is one of the processes of the water cycle, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually spelled out for students in the scale. Now the 1 doesn't have new content. The 1 just says the student, on his or her own, doesn't look like they know the content at all. However, with help, the student demonstrates partial understanding of some of the knowledge. So this is where student and teacher interact, and on his or her own, the student has trouble with and actually can't demonstrate competence at score 2 or score 3, but with help can. And then finally, we go to the 0. The student provides little or no response, and even with help, the student does not exhibit a partial understanding of knowledge. Now, by the way, I've never seen a student get a 0, because usually with help they can do something. But there is a theoretical 0, and that is even with help, the student can't demonstrate understanding or skill. So the 3 is your target. The 2 is the simpler content. The 1 is with help they can do some of it. The 0 is even with help they can't. And the 4 is they go above and beyond level 3, score 3. They make inferences and applications, that go beyond what was explicitly taught. Now, You know, a lot of schools and districts we work with actually put in a description of that. They infer relationships regarding atmospheric processes in the water cycle. So the scales are pretty straightforward to put together. The 3 is your target. You know, you write that first. The 2 is some of the simpler content. And the 4 is an application of the score 3 content. So 0 through 4 scale, five levels, if you will. Now, one way of designing a test, one way only, there are many ways, is to make sure you have items at all 3 levels. So you have level 2 items, you know, simpler content. You have level 3 items or score 3 items, complex ideas and processes that were explicitly taught. And you also have some items in there for level 4 or score 4, where students are asked to apply their knowledge, make inferences and applications that go beyond what was explicitly taught. And when you score an assessment, it's actually fairly efficient. Let me play this out with you. Let's say the student answers level 2 items correctly, but does not answer level 3 and level 4 items correctly. What's a student's score? Well, it's pretty simple in a system like this. That means they've got a score of 2.0. Next student answers level 2 and 3 items correctly, but not level 4. Pretty simple. Their score is 3. Student misses all items. With help can answer some correctly. Their score is a 1. Okay, and student misses all items even when help. That's a 0. Now you see a problem right there, and what happens? You say, what happens if they answer all the score 2 content correctly, you know, and only some of the score 3 content? Well, that's where we have half-point scores. The student gets a score of 2.5, so the complete scale has half-point scores. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 with half-point scores. Now, again, there's great detail in the book that I mentioned, but it's a fairly intuitive construct. It really is. Now, let me go back to that test that I had put together, that sample assessment, or at least the description of the sample assessment. Let's try to score it again. If all teachers were using the same scale, you're using this scale, all teachers would then have the same set of rules they use to interpret the student's responses. So the student got all correct with Section A. Well, I tricked you here. If you notice that Section A was really score 2 or level 2 content. It was simpler stuff, simple but important details. The student got 2 out of 4 correct for Section B, and Section B was the more complex content that was directly taught, and the student got none correct for Section C, and that's where the student was asked to make inferences and application that went beyond what was actually taught. So now it's fairly straightforward. No matter who scores the assessment, they should come up with the same score. All correct for score at level 2, partial correct for level 3, and then correct for level 4. So what do you get? We get a score of 2.5. Now, here's what we found. Using this scale, you know, regardless of the assessment that the teacher has used, if 2 teachers are assessing the same topic and use the same scale to score their assessments, they will come up with the same score. In other words, the reliability is much higher. And that 0.45 typical reliability in a teacher-designed assessment now goes up dramatically simply from having a common scale, you know, that teachers start with in terms of their design of the assessments and their scoring of the assessments. Now, that scale we've worked on for years. Nothing is perfect. You know, it's certainly leaky. You know, we live in an imprecise world in terms of trying to assess student competence, because we're trying to assess something that's typically, basically, unobservable. What do they have in their head about this content that I've gone over? But what we found is that easy to understand, easy to correct scales using just 3, 2, and 4. 3 is your target content, 2 is the simpler stuff, 4 goes above and beyond. 1 is they can do it, but they need help, and 0 is even with help they can't do it. Teachers can design assessments and score them in a fairly reliable fashion, at least more reliable than what we do right now. It also opens the door to a lot of different types of assessments. Hope you remember this. That is the obtrusive, the unobtrusive, and the student-generated assessments. Remember, those are the 3 types of assessments. Well, I've just demonstrated that, sorry. Just demonstrated that teachers can still use the traditional test, the traditional form of, the most commonly used form of obtrusive assessments, and design and score them. But now teachers have more available to them unobtrusive assessments. Let me use the example of the student kicking the soccer ball. Without a scale or rubric, I go out and watch the student, kick the soccer ball and say, geez, doing a nice job, just, doing exactly what I've told him. Now, he could still fine-tune that, but in terms of what I taught the student, he's doing perfectly. With a 100-point scale, I can't do much with that. What do I give the student, a 90? Well, why didn't I give him a 92 or 88? However, with a scale, you can say a solid 3. Student's a solid 3. Can go above and beyond what I taught, make some fine-tunings, but solid 3. I do apologize. The teacher walking around the class who's taught a certain brushstroke in art. Now again, as long as you have a scale, sees a particular student using the scale above and beyond what the teacher demonstrated, the student's a 4. That can be recorded, and now you've got another formative score that did not come from, a typical test. And finally, student-generated. The scales open the door to the student-generated. Because see, now students can say, I'm ready to show you that I'm a score 3. You've got me as a 2, or you got me as a 2.5, where I know the simpler content and partial knowledge and the more complex, but I can demonstrate to you that I'm a 3, and here's how I'm going to do it. And the student now says to the teacher, this is what I'm going to do. It could be a project. It could be the student says, tomorrow, you can ask me any one of the questions, I can demonstrate that I can do any of the problems in the back of the book relative to this topic, or I will compute this quantity using information from the newspaper to show you I can use this strategy for data analysis. So the student creates the type of assessment he or she wants to use to demonstrate they know the content. That changes the whole dynamic in the classroom, I found. So for me, I'm more excited about student-generated assessment than anything I've been excited about in years, maybe decades. It changes the whole dynamic when students start saying to the teacher, here's what I'm going to do to demonstrate. They're now taking some responsibility for their own assessment, some responsibility for the scores they receive. Even the traditional area of obtrusive assessments, I think, are augmented by the use of rigorous scales. We call them scales as opposed to rubrics. Again, sorry. As we can see, you still have your paper pencil test, and I can design and score those. I can use projects, and that's pretty simple. We've been actually scoring projects. We, K-12 education, have been scoring projects by rubrics for a long time. But this also opens us up to another form of obtrusive assessment. We call it probing discussion. And here's what probing discussion looks like. The teacher sits down with the student, and this is not with help. The teacher just says, start explaining to me what you know about the cell membrane. Just a second. Yes. Oh, thank you very much. Boy, you're lucky you're not here. I'd give you my cold. So that I'm a science teacher. We've gone over stuff about the cell, and you say, Bob, come up to me. Okay, start talking about the cell. I start explaining to you and say a little more about that. Okay, how about this over here? And he said, well, go back to that thing you said before. Explain that a little more. How does that relate to what you just said over here? Probing discussion. Actually, there's research on this, how much information that a teacher can get from a probing discussion. Sheila Valencia, professor, actually a reading professor at University of Washington a number of years ago, did a study on 4 different types of assessments and how much information you got from those 4. One was the typical, forced choice or selected response type of items. That's the multiple choice, the true false, like that. By the way, the topic was the same across all of these assessments, happening in middle school science. Second assessment was short constructed response. And short constructed response, we all know what those are. You ask a student, here's the topic, describe it for me, explain it. So it's not a big essay, it's just, a student explains in a written form. The third type of assessment on these science topics, or this science topic, was a combination of the short constructed response and the selected response, so multiple choice and then, explain type items. The fourth type of assessment was what we call a probing discussion. Now, out of those 4, which gave the teacher the most information about students? Well, you can guess it was the probing discussion. And if my memory serves, you got 66% more information from the probing discussion than you could get from any of those other 3 types of assessment. Now, if that sounds, fairly shocking, just think about it. you know your content, you can sit down with a student and say, how about this, how about this, how about this, in very quick order. You can actually determine, what a student knows and doesn't know. Now, if you have a scale, a rubric for that particular topic, you can also assign a score. You can say, hey, based on this conversation, you are a solid 3. Everything we've gone over in class, the simpler stuff, the more complex stuff you've got, and actually you made some applications there that I've never taught. So right now, based on this, you're a 3.5. So the scale, opens up all different types of assessment, which with the 100-point scale you can't get at. You can't use a 100-point scale to assign a score to a probing discussion. At least you can't do it very well. Again, you sit down with the student does a good job, misses a couple of things, and what do? Well, you're a 78, you're an 84, well, why not an 85 or an 86? The scales help, give a more reliable judgment, and there's always imprecision. We just can't get away from it. Now, I'm skipping a lot here. There are really a number of different ways of designing assessments. I gave you only one, and that is have an assessment with all 3 categories of knowledge, the score 2, the score 3, and the score 4. You can do assessments without that. Actually we have 4 different approaches to using this scale. I just don't have time to go into that because I wanted to spend time talking about report cards because that's such a huge issue. Report cards are here for good. You might say, well, gee, how do you translate this into traditional A, B, C's, and D's? Well, first of all, you don't have to, but in today's culture, if you will, if you don't have A, B's, and C's, at least at the secondary level, you probably got some, big discussions on your mind or concerns. So we say, okay, if you want to do that, you can still do it. And here's how you do it. You translate rubric scores into traditional A, B, C's, and D's, and F's. So let me set this up. I'm a teacher, and this quarter, this grading period, I have gone over 6 different topics. And for those 6 topics, I've had a scale, a rubric for each one. And at the end of the grading period, I've got a summative score for each student on each of the 6 topics. So the student might have got a summative score of 3 for the first topic and a 2.5 for the second topic and a 4 for the third topic. You get the idea. If I average across those topics, then I can get a central tendency or an average score across the topics. And if that average score is between a 3 or a 4, you might translate that to an A. Between a 2.5 and a 2.99, translate that to a B. You get the idea. Now, you don't have to follow these exact intervals, but they do make sense. 3 to a 4 is an A. Why do you say, well, that's a big range? Well, remember, the 3 on the scale says the student understands everything that was explicitly taught. The 4 says the student goes above and beyond what was explicitly taught. So, anything from a 3 to a 4 across a bunch of topics, that's typically, in the A category for teachers who use the scale and translate it to A, B, C's, et cetera, et cetera. 2.5 to 2.99 is a B. You get the idea. Now, by the way, an overall grade I can't defend on any grounds in terms of measurement. It's not good measurement because you're putting together very different things. You're putting together 6 different topics, if you will, for a central tendency. I can't say that it helps kids learn. Why would I even talk about an overall grade? Well, it's because they're used. And in the current reality, teachers commonly have to give an overall grade. This would be the way of doing it. Bit of a aside here, but related. I'm sure you've heard that you shouldn't average. Well, that is true within a topic, but not across topics. Let me explain that. Remember I said I'm the teacher. I taught 6 topics. For each one of those topics, I was tracking student progress over time. Hopefully the student's getting better and better. And the summative score is the score that represents their final status. Now, within a topic, you should not average, because an average won't take into account that the student is learning. So you never average within a topic, but across topics, you're pretty much stuck if you're going to put those together. And you're stuck usually with some central tendency, and that's what an average is. But you could use the median and the mode and things like that. Again, excuse me. Another variation here. Let me go to schools and districts that don't use the A, B's, and C's, but they use Advanced, Proficient, Basic, well, you can do the same thing. If you've got, 6 different scores, summative scores in 6 different topics, you can average those, and say if it's from the score, the average score is between a 3.5 and a 4.0, you can call that advanced. 2.5 to 3.49, you get the idea. Again, these are, you don't have to use these intervals. They're not arbitrary. They have a logic. Some teachers even use the percentage score because they have to. In their district, they're required to turn in a score of 95 or like that. Well, again, you can average scores on the rubric scale and then turn those into percentages. So there are translations. Now, by the way, if you happen to look at the book, you'll see a lot more ways of translating. So we can come up with a report card. So let me show you what it might look like when you get a report card. Here's one example. Now I'm going to blow this up for you a little bit. Notice at the top we've still got our letter grades, but that's nothing new. Okay, now we've just seen how you can translate the rubric scores into those. What is different, though, is look at what's underneath. Now this is only one page of the report card. You would have a page for mathematics and science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the top of the report card looks the same, your traditional ABCs. Okay, but then underneath you have bar graphs. Now notice that the bar graph, the bar graph has a dark part and a light part. So let's look at language arts, word recognition, and vocabulary. The student received a score of 3.5. That bar graph represents the 3.5. But there's a dark part and a light part. You might ask what the dark part is. Dark part, that's where the student started. So the gray part is student growth since the last grading period, the last reporting period. So there's some real advantages in being able to show growth. Let me go back to this again. If you put the whole report card together, you've got a pretty nice, data set there. You still got your traditional report cards, but now, you've got graphs for individual topics. Notice down here, life skills. Let me show you what they look like. Life skills. So those are things like participation, work completion, behavior, working in groups. We can do those too. There are rubrics or scales that can be and have been devised for those. So most people who use this report card and adaptation like it very much. It still can look very traditional, but you can also get very specific. So now students, teachers, parents, and students want to know, well, how come my student got a D in science? And now you can look at it. This is not the science one, but you would look at the bar graphs and see where the student was low and where the student was high. So there's no mystery in a report card like this in terms of how a grade was computed. Parents and students can look at it and say, well, gee, you've got to come up. You've got to bring your, the student has to bring his understanding or skill up in very, very specific areas instead of just this A, B, C, where you're not sure where the student's strong, where the student's weak. Now, if an individual student really wanted to, he or she could be standards-based in their classroom, even within the context of a traditional system. And there are teachers that are doing this. Let me explain what that might look like. Here's the first quarter, and it's for me. I'm the student, and these are my scores on 6 different topics. So that's topic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these are the summative scores I received for first quarter on these 6 topics. 2.5 in topic 1, 2.5 in topic 2. You get the idea. Now, we've already just seen that could be translated into a traditional grade. Nothing new there. Okay. However, let's look at the next quarter. Okay, and now let's see what's happened. Notice that I've got 6 new topics that have been addressed. And the student got a 3 in the first new topic, a 2.5 in the second, 1.5, 3, 2.5, 2.5. But also notice the second quarter grade includes the first quarter topics, but look at what's happened to the first quarter topics. The student went from a 2.5 to a 3 on the first topic, a 2.5 to a 3. You get the idea. See, in a system like this, the student has the opportunity to go back and raise his or her scores on previous topics. Now, that's a very different classroom. It really is. It's a classroom where maybe on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, let's say for argument's sake, the teacher's presenting new content. Those are the new topics for the grading period. But on Tuesday and Thursday, students are working in small groups or individually to either master the new content or go back and raise their scores on previous content. So it's a very different very different type of classroom. The teacher is still presenting new content, but there's also time for the students to go back and raise their scores. So you can see where I'm going here. Third quarter, okay, new content, that's in the black, but the student has raised his or her scores on previous content. By the time you get to the fourth quarter, the grade reflects all of the content that has been addressed the entire year. Now, by the way, this actually reflects, I would assert, the intent of the standards documents in all states, whether it's implicitly stated or explicitly stated. If you read the state standards documents and even the National Common Core, what you see is that the standards are expectations at the end of the year, implying that students have the entire year to master the content. This actually operationalizes it. There's a technology that helps doing this. We've worked a lot with Global Scholar. They've got a record-keeping system, a technology-based record-keeping system that allows teachers to enter these scores, and it keeps track of the scores for the teacher. Now, one of the really big benefits of a system like this is students can track their progress the entire year. Let me show you what that looks like. This is a little chart that each student keeps. So my name would be up at the top, and notice it has T1, T2. Those are topics. Topic 1 through topic 24. Now that means over the whole year there's going to be 24 topics. This might be the end of the first grading period and only 10 topics have been addressed so far. Okay, and here are the student scores. So on topic 1 I got a 2.5 and topic 2 a 1.5. You get the idea. Now again, we saw how we can translate that into an overall grade. Okay, here's the next the next quarter now. New topics have been added, so you can see what new topics have been added. Okay, let me go to the third quarter, and more topics have been added, but notice what's starting to happen. Okay, not only have new topics been added, the student is going back and increasing his or her score in previous topics, and here's the end of the fourth quarter. All 24 topics have been addressed, and the student has had a chance to increase his or her scores all across the quarter. Now, what we found is this simple tracking progress, real simple, one chart for every student. They're keeping track. Teacher still keeps track. You're using electronic grade books that are amenable to this. You're doing that electronically. But there's a real visual mapping of how well the student's doing. What he's mastered, what he or she hasn't mastered, what they still have to work in, and they gradually fill in the graph. I would assert just doing this would have a positive impact on student achievement, just because the visual nature of it, and the student always sees, I'm doing a fine job in this, I've got to go back and work on this. Now, Jed, I'm not sure if you're going to talk about our events, or if you want me to. I can just do that, because questions will come up afterwards. So, Jed, jump in if you want, but if not, I'll do this. You going to do that, Jeff?
Go ahead, Bob. If you'd like to talk about these events, that'd be wonderful.
Well, okay, if you're interested in this, we've got some events coming up October 13th and 14th in Jacksonville, Florida, by Jan Hogue and Phil Wart, two of our associates who specialize in assessment. Also in Jacksonville, October 11th and 12th, so you see where we stage these. 13th and 14th, but if you want to, go for both sessions on the 11th and 12th, we've got a two-day workshop on our new book, The Highly Engaged Classroom, which we're very excited about. Of course, I didn't talk about that today. I talked about assessments. So I'm sure if you're interested in that, we'll give you all the information that you would need. So, questions? We have 7 minutes. Jed, are you going to help me with these?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. We've got some great questions. They started coming a little later than usual, but the group has made up for them with some wonderful questions. The first one should be a quick one. Is it possible to get a listing of schools already implementing this model of assessment? This person would like to look into this more deeply.
Not a listing. We just don't keep it. I can name some for you, though. And actually, if you go to Global Scholar, the Pinnacle Suite, and talk to those folks, they'll give you people who purchased their particular software to do it. Adams 50 School District outside of Denver, Colorado, they are actually standards-based throughout the whole system. They don't even have grade levels. They use this system. The Lindsay Unified School District in California uses the system. Let's see, I had one here. West York Area School District, where is that? In York, Pennsylvania. They've done adaptations. So we don't keep a running tally. You know, the numbers aren't huge, but given where we started 15 years ago, the numbers of schools are growing rapidly. Individual teachers, you know, I could say that number is growing, you know, quite rapidly, but they then translate to their own, you know, their own particular system. So in other words, there are teachers in the state of Texas, let's say, who use the system, but still what they have to turn in is a percentage score for students. There are a lot of teachers making adaptations. This was something I never thought I would see in my lifetime because such a big change kind of culturally, but I just might see it. You know, I think it's starting to move at a geometric pace, but still, the numbers aren't huge in terms of schools and districts, certainly more schools than districts. So no, the short answer is no.
Thank you. And we'll try to get the listing of those 3 school districts that you talked about in that email that we send out to everyone. Just so that you know that you'll have that folks out there. Here's a question, and a lot of these are based on the rubrics. How do you assure that teachers are accurately using the rubrics in their assessment?
Oh, great example. Well, that's where common assessments come in. Yeah, I didn't mention those, but common assessments are great things. You should still have them. But this time, the common assessments are designed using the rubrics. You know, I work a lot with Rick Dufour's fine, Rick and Becky Dufour and Bob Aker, you know, and they've been a proponent of common assessments for years and years and years, of course. The only change I would say is the group gets together and creates the scale first, and then the common assessment from the scale. Now, if you have that common assessment that every teacher has to use, now you can compare scores. You can actually have, on that common assessment, you can have more than one teacher score assessments for students, just as kind of a reliability check. So that's, that external criterion called a common assessment, you can then periodically say, you know, when teachers are scoring the same student's paper, are they, or a test, are they coming up with the same score? So the two go hand in glove. It's great to have the common assessments, but now occasionally what you do is make, you know, multiple teachers score certain students' assessments and see if you get the same scores. And that right now we don't have that. We have no way to do that. With the common scale, though, you do.
Great. Well, thank you. And here's another question from Lorena. She is, how might rubrics support our work with EL and special ed students?
Well, actually, special ed, they've been doing this for years. You know, individual student profiles, you know, IPs. They've, you know, so this actually has been used by special ed for a long time. So it's a natural fit there. Now, how you translate the 3 or 2 that a student got on a scale to a grade, you know, that's as problematic as it is right now. We say create the scale, you know, for the content. You know, for special ed, you've got to decide to use the same scale, you know, as with regular ed, or do you create another scale? In other words, remember you start with a 3, and then the 2, and then the 4. Do you change your 3, you know, with special ed students, and that is the expectation at a given grade level for a topic is lower. Those are all local decisions. ELL, you know, totally different ballgame. With ELL students, you're, you know, still, you know, having them try to meet the content that's prescribed by the school or state or Common Core. What the scales do to benefit the ELL student, though, is the student-generated assessment. You see, with an ELL student, they might know the content, but there's a huge language problem in terms of the assessment. If they could just read the assessment or understand the assessment, they can demonstrate knowledge. What the scales do is give them multiple ways to demonstrate the knowledge. So an ELL student might do poorly on the common assessment, not because he or she doesn't know the content, but because he or she has trouble with their non-native language, you know, English, and trying to understand what's being asked. With the scales now, that you've got a whole bunch of ways of finding out from the students, including student-generated. And the probing discussion, you know, powerful tool with ELL students. You can just say, explain it to me. and even though the student might not be using perfect English syntax or, phonology or semantics, it's still clear. They know the content.
That's great. We've got time for a few more. This kind of sums up a couple questions that I've seen come up. What's the biggest hesitation among teachers to implementing this model?
Tradition. I feel like I should break into one of the songs from I should be Tevye here for Fiddler on the Roof. Tradition. That we're just we're so used to the 100-point scale. It's a very, very different way of thinking. Once teachers do it and make the transition, all of the other pieces seem to fall in place. Record keeping is another thing. They say, well, record keeping is harder. I would assert it's not. That it's just different. And if you have technology, that does this for you, record keeping is no problem. If you have the computer-based technology, the web-based technology, where all I have to do is for this given assessment that I did, and again, the Global Scholar technology would do this for you, or the Pinnacle suite within Global Scholar. All I got to do is say this assessment, was on this particular topic or scale, okay, and then that's all I got to do. There's a drop-down menu, and I just tell it what topic I was, assessing, and now my student roster comes up, a little matrix, and there's Bobby at the top, and I just put down the score for him, and Sally and Mary, et cetera, and all the data is kept track for in terms of those graphs, et cetera, et cetera. So with technology, the record keeping is no problem at all. But it's different. We've used the 100-point scale, for 100 years, basically. And so it's just a very, very different way of thinking. Quite frankly, I can't name a teacher who made the transition to this and said the old way was better. I can name teachers who said, too hard, I'm not going to do it. So they really never gave it a try. But those people who have tried it usually come back and say, I can communicate better with my students. They understand better what's going on. I understand the content better because I actually had to identify the 3s, the 2, and the 4. And before, I only had to identify the 3. So for me, it has multiple advantages. Of course, I'm not an unbiased, observer of all of this. So I'm pretty enthusiastic about it.
All right, great. Let's do one more, and this is kind of a hypothetical. Hopefully this will be kind of a fun one for you. If you were the writer of the standardized exams, state exams, SATs, how would you redesign the scoring or the design of the test itself so that schools could use the data more effectively?
While using the scale, remember, the 5-point scale, there's only 3 levels of knowledge, the target, above, and below. Now, obviously, content can be layered into, more finer levels. It's just that it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do, let's say you add one more level. It's just hard. Well, here's the target, and then below that, and then below that, and then above that, and it's kind of no easy way of explaining, well, what's the rule for the one below and then the one below that. We found 3 levels. It's intuitive. It's easy. Target, below, and above. People can get it. So if I were a king for the day when designing tests, I would say, well, let's present the content like that to teachers. So the test specs, if you will, would spell out, here's, for this particular topic called probability in mathematics, here's the 3, here's the simpler stuff, and here's the 4. And so the teachers would have, those who are trying to interpret test scores from students could go back and, then say, well, great, we have to work on this, for this particular topic, these elements here for this particular student. I'd also scale the test so that students knew this section's the easy stuff. This section is the more complex stuff, but which should have been explicitly taught. And this section up here is the, more advanced, where you're not going to have answers probably that you got in class. You're going to have to make applications. So I think the way we set up assessments now, it's kind of a gotcha mentality, even though it's not mean-spirited. It's kind of a, well, let's figure out, items that will separate out those who really know the content from those who don't know the content so very well. This is a very different system. That's more of a norming system. Let's see who's at the top and who's at the bottom. This is more of a mastery orientation. We're trying to say we just want to figure out where students are so that the assessment information can be used to help the students get better. Very different purpose, very different purpose to assessment. Here, the purpose is to help all students go as far as they can, with the traditional forms of large-scale assessments, although not mean-spirited, certainly in intent. The idea was, how do we spread out the distribution? That's what we're looking for. So my state test would be very transparent to the students. Rigorous, but very transparent.
All right, good. And, we just had a couple more questions jump up that I think are linked that are important. How supportive are universities of this type of system for reporting and grading, and how does that affect grades and GPAs and transcripts?
Well, remember, you can still have your grades. That's why I showed you that report card. So I still end up with a B in mathematics, and that B gets turned to 3 points, 3 quality points. So you can look very, very traditional. Now, other than just that B, if the university wants, they can actually say how I did on specific topics. Now, I don't, interact with those folks, so I can't speak for them. However, I did have an experience a while back now. It was in Philadelphia. It was a conference put on by Grant Wiggins, a great assessment person, and it was on grading. And I presented, my view of things, as did other people. But he had a panel of university admissions folks. And I actually presented my version of a report card to them, and their response was quite positive. They liked the idea they could still have their traditional grades, but what they said is they really liked the level of detail, that they could look by topic. Now the tricky part is if we didn't give grades. That's where it gets tricky. Now I do see the day when we don't have overall grades, like for mathematics. But in the short term we're going to. So I think that's the big step. If we ever got rid of grades, overall grades, that's when it's a real, at this point in time, disconnect between what we do in K-12 and higher ed. But anyway, I could see all that being overcome over time.
Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So I'd like to thank you, Bob, for this great session, and thank you for all the people listening. And just to remind you, you will receive the email that has the link to this session, so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. And we hope we'll see you in Florida in October. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.